Finance Minister Tito Mboweni will be tabling the much-anticipated budget speech tomorrow. Mboweni's 2020-2021 budget will be the toughest ever presented to Parliament as the country is still reeling from the prolonged COVID-19 lockdown, which has caused an economic bloodbath, with many businesses shutting down or shedding jobs. For more on what to expect in tomorrow's budget, we're now joined by Associate Professor at the Wits School of Governance, Professor William Gumede. Prof, thanks very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the programme.
Good evening. Yes, no, thank you for having me.
All right. I mean, it's starting to get boring, but every time we have a budget, it keeps on starting with, is this going to be the toughest budget yet?
I think this is the toughest budget. I know we've been, the years before, every year we say it's a tough budget, but this is it. This is the monster of all budgets. Think about it. I mean, we're in a worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. You have to think of the 1920s. How many people in South Africa are alive to remember the 1920s? I mean, it is that bad. And then two things, that Tito Mboweni as a finance minister needs to do. Firstly, he really has to deal with, unfortunately, the overhang of the wastage and corruption of the so-called wasted years of Jacob Zuma. It's really caused the public finance in total disarray. We don't have enough money and so on. And then secondly, what he needs to do at the same time, he now really needs to deal with economic finance, the financial crisis from COVID. Itself devastating. I mean, we've just seen today figures from Stats South Africa, 32.5% is the unemployment. I mean, we've never seen this kind of figures. We're talking here about half of all adults are unemployed in the country. And then thirdly, what this budget needs to do is to say, well, how can we get growth going at the same time? So, and these things appear all contradictory, because if you want to clean up after wastage, you kind of have to tighten your belt a little bit. But if you want to have growth after a financial crisis, you can't tighten your belt. You have to, put more resources in. So the budget is.
All right, so the budget deficit is going to increase significantly, and that tells us that tax revenues have been very difficult to come by. Those unemployment figures that you've just mentioned also point to the fact that revenues are going to be difficult to come by. Businesses have failed, tax revenues difficult to come by. So how does one balance the books? Sometimes you raise your taxes, but if you do that, then you cripple the other businesses that have just survived. So how does a finance minister pay for things when he's got no money?
I mean, this is not a time now to raise taxes because, people are unemployed. Factories have closed down. Business are struggling. And, people who wanted to make investments have actually cancelled the investment because it's a very tough COVID period. So, very little new revenue coming in, for the state. But at the same time, the state also lacks the credibility to raise any taxes. Because you think all the corruption has been happening, the wastes and so on. The state has no moral authority to raise taxes either. So what do we need to do? What will be in this budget? Really, it will be a reprioritizing, really, of, or refocusing of the budget, moving it away from some of things that could be luxuries to much more needed areas, and also moving money to areas that can create jobs very quickly, that has a very big development impact. So cut the fat. But cut the fat at the right places, not at the places that would cause more pain for ordinary South Africans. And then, also increase efficiency in the state itself, because we've got so much wastage. If you just think about it, one inefficiency is the bailouts of state-owned companies. I mean, if you think about it, the last 5 years or so, almost close to 3 trillion rand has been wasted on bailouts. So we can't afford this now going forward. We cannot bail out state entities that's not efficient.
All right, public sector wages, that's a thorny issue, particularly with local government elections on the horizon. So, these politicians have got political imperatives at the same time. But can the president perhaps lead the way? Because when he took over, he promised to trim his cabinet. He did a little bit, but a lot of people felt that just wasn't enough. Maybe this is the cover that he needed to take a bold move and say, you know what, we've all got to tighten our belts. I'm cutting my cabinet.
I mean, a very big part of this budget, of course, is, cutting the public sector budget. I mean, Tito Mboweni, the Treasury argued that, over 3 years, they can save about close to 217 billion rand. So that's there's a big amount of money if they freeze over 3 years the public sector wages. Now, of course, trade unions are totally opposed to it. The public sector workers are saying no, 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 no. These are tough times, but I think it will be really important that there is some kind of wage freeze in the public sector. Because we cannot afford some people in the public sector protected, soft jobs, and while others are losing their jobs in the private sector or struggling in the informal sector. So there has to be political will to pull that through. Although, their case is still going to the Constitutional Court, so it's not all in the hands, unfortunately, of the Treasury or of Sir Ramaphosa. We have to hear what the courts say about whether government has the right to freeze the wages over the next 3 years. But it is going to be very important that President Ramaphosa actually set an example and not only freeze the wages of politicians, parliamentarians, councillors, and so on, but I think cut the wages of politicians. I think that really we need that, given the corruption that's been going on over the last couple of years and the lack of credibility in government. I think at least a quarter cut or a third of the cuts in the salaries of politicians will be a very important signal to the country.
So tomorrow evening, what we know for sure is the ANC is going to support the budget and say, yes, we're doing the best we can. Pretty much all the opposition parties are going to say, no, he hasn't done enough. He's not going to please everybody. But if we took politics to one side, what do you think the 1-2 things that we can do, perhaps, that could get us the most benefit going forward?
If you're a president of a country or if you're a government, you cannot govern to please everyone. What you have to do is govern in the public interest. And unfortunately, so far with the Ramaphosa presidency has tried to govern to please everyone. Now you have to make tough political decisions. You have to ride out those political decisions, and you have to take courageous political decisions. That's important. That is leadership in a crisis, in an emergency, because we're in a crisis now, in an emergency. I think, what can we do as citizens? I think the very first thing is, because the state doesn't have the revenue and the income, and the state doesn't have the capacity either, it would be very important that the state partner with the private sector, with civil society, and with citizens and with professionals. Very, very important, because what it brings, it will bring skills, it will bring money, it will bring ideas to help us through the crisis. It's going to be absolutely important. And I think as individual South Africans, business, must try their best where they can, to retain jobs, maybe to reduce their profits. So, if why do you take a 10% profit if you could take, say, half of that, but to keep jobs? So these type of things are going to be important. Individual civil servants will have to be, more productive when nobody looks at them. They have to perform, and because they have to be mindful. These are difficult times for most South Africans, and we cannot waste money in the public sector or in the state.